I'm Liz Simmons. I'm the curator of art and engagement here at the Juliet Art Museum at the Clay Center. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's discussion. We are hoping that our recording devices are working so that we can broadcast this to a virtual audience at a later date. This discussion is being held in tandem with our current exhibition, More Than a Passing Observation, William and Louis Sonntag and Landscape Mania in the United States. And I think most of you have had a chance to view the exhibition before, but if not, the gallery will be open for a little while afterwards. So there will be time to see the show and have some more casual conversation with our panelists. We're excited to welcome both Dr. Wendy Castenell and Dr. Julia Sienkewicz tonight. I'll turn it over to them in a moment. We ask that you please hold questions till the end. We'll have plenty of time for intimate Q&A. Now a little bit more about our speakers. So Dr. Sienkewicz is an associate professor of art history at Roanoke College and the guest curator of our landscape exhibition. She received her BA from Mount Holyoke and her MA and PhD from the University of Illinois. She's written many articles and books on landscape and American art, including Epic Landscapes, Benjamin Henry Latrobe and the Art of Watercolor from 2019, and she also wrote the catalog for our exhibition. Sienkewicz has been the recipient of many awards supporting her research, including a Terra Foundation Fellowship Rome Prize at the American Academy in Rome, the Joshua C. Taylor Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, a fellowship in American Art with the Luce Foundation and the American Council of Learned Societies, and other research fellowships at the Yale Center for British Art, Winterthur Museum, and the United States Capitol. Dr. Wendy Castenell is an assistant professor of art history at Washington and Lee University, where she serves as one of the university's inaugural Delaney Scholars. She received her BA from Tulane, her MA from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and her PhD from the University of Missouri. Her publications cover the visual culture of the American South and representations of race and ethnicity, including her article, The Louisiana Experiment, Alsace Portraits and Afro-Creole Leadership During Reconstruction, and her forthcoming book, Creole Identity and the Art of the American South, Louisiana from the Colonial Era to Reconstruction. Castenell is currently the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the Newberry Library in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julia Sienkewicz and Dr. Wendy Castenell.
So to begin, I'm going to start this off a little bit, and then it will be kind of conversational between Dr. Wendy Castenell and myself. So I thought it would be useful to begin our evening discussing the origins of this exhibition and how the evolution of research in preparing the show brought us to this particular conversation tonight, in which we will consider some aspects of how race has been approached in scholarship about the American landscape tradition, and specifically with respect to the legacy of Robert Duncanson, who is now celebrated as the first known professional and internationally recognized, one of the first known professional and internationally recognized African-American artists of the 19th century. This exhibition has its origins pre-pandemic, when I met Roanoke College trustee Andy Teeter, back row there, hi Andy, at an event in our gallery at the college. Since I was a new faculty member in the art history program at that time, he and I got to talking about art pretty quickly. And as soon as he learned that I was a specialist in 19th century American art, he asked me what I knew about William Sonntag. And being an honest person, though perhaps a bit reluctant at that time, I admitted I knew almost nothing. I'm probably not supposed to admit that fact right now, since I'm here as the guest curator of this exhibition. But the reality is that almost nobody knows a great amount about William Sonntag. He was a prolific and popular landscape painter over an approximately 50-year career. And while his works are in major collections across this country, Sonntag has received minimal attention from scholars. With only 3 major works of scholarship delving deeply into his career, inclusive of the catalog for the present exhibition. So following up on this first conversation with Mr. Teeter, I was able to recruit one of our excellent art history seniors to complete her senior seminar research paper on fishing on the Potomac, Eastern Panhandle, West Virginia, a Sonntag painting in Mr. Teeter's collection and featured up here to my right. Sam Riggs, our student, herself a West Virginia native, and I came to Charleston. We studied the painting in detail and began the process of conducting primary source and comparative research. Then a few semesters later, I was approached by the Oil and Galleries at Roanoke College with the opportunity to curate a show in our gallery, and of course my thoughts went immediately to fishing on the Potomac. So after several years of planning and research, More Than a Passing Observation opened at its first venue, Roanoke Art Galleries, in October 2022. Tonight's conversation builds on an important detail about Sonntag. Although his paintings have received limited scholarly attention, his name appears in brief mentions in several recent books about Robert Duncanson. Both Sonntag and Duncanson were born outside of Pittsburgh and launched their careers from Cincinnati, Ohio. And both painted several of their major works highlighting this region, in Sonntag's case, many of his major works. Most significantly, it has often been stated that Sonntag was Duncanson's teacher and that the two traveled to Europe together for what would have been their first grand tour experience and kind of a finishing project of their art training. Yet my research uncovered more questions than answers about the real nature of this relationship and about how it should be considered within the history of American landscape painting. So tonight, Wendy and I, we're gonna share some questions and observations back and forth concerning the careers of these two artists within the larger web of race and its role in art historical interpretation. We hope to use this conversation both to open the doors for further research and also to reposition some of the ways that both of these artists are approached by museums and curators. So first, we wanted to reflect a little bit about how American landscape paintings work and how they work visually, and in particular, how the 19th century white American sense of self might be built into that manner of viewing. So let's talk about our headline work, Fishing on the Potomac, Eastern Panhandle, West Virginia. If we look at this piece, we have a clear foreground, middle ground, background. These are strategies of landscape composition that have existed back several centuries by the time Sonntag begins his artistic practice. In the middle, you have the river that leads your eye through to a hazy background of mountains. And the light on that horizon area really pulls you in. It's got this glow to it. Our first impression is of a wilderness location, or even we could call it Eden. This is reminiscent of the famous line in one of John Locke's essays, his essay on property, in his second treatise published in the 1680s, where he says, in the beginning, all the world was America. So the piece really captures this wilderness ethos at a first glance. Yet, it's not wilderness. The viewer is invited to see the landscape both as available for the taking and as in the process of colonization already. So how does this work? In the foreground, we have these figures, which in landscape painting we call staffage figures. They welcome you into the piece. They send you to look further in particular directions. In this case, they're engaged in conversation with one another. They're standing on the banks of the river toward the foreground, and they're also pointing. You see that gesture across the water. So let's follow where they send us. And what we see, of course, is a cabin in a freshly made clearing, complete with several human figures, perhaps 4, definitely 3. You can see these two quite prominently, and then back here against the house, some other gestures toward additional figures. So we know that this place is inhabited. It's already no longer wilderness. And as we circle around back toward those Dephage figures, we can see this twist of gray smoke behind the hill at left. The progress of civilization has begun, and it's detectable, even in this remote, very familiar mountain location. So incidentally, what we've just done here, this tour through this painting, is a theme in the title of this exhibit itself. These landscape paintings are not meant to be looked at quickly. They're not created in a fast process of moving through the landscape. We're supposed to follow the gaze and really meditate and explore. As one critic said, the artist's process, which involves more than a passing observation, of digging deeply, exploring the visual experience of place. Wendy, did you want to jump in on this one at all? Or should we go through the next one?
Let's just go through
Yeah,
it.
then we'll do the questions. Okay. Now we can build on this idea a little bit more if we look at John Frederick Kensett's piece, also included in the present exhibition. Here we can see these ideas of colonization and landscape represented even more directly in Kensett's work. And notice it is actually called In the Wilderness. I'll show you the details so you can really think about this. Who is in this covered wagon? We are supposed to understand implicitly that this work shows us the white Anglo-American settler traveling through this wilderness landscape to homestead, perhaps to a location like what we saw in Sonntag's work. Now I want to say as an aside here that we have this assumption as viewers, and we're expected to have them, even as Kensett and his contemporaries were part of a cultural climate where there was great concern, great anxiety about the huge waves of immigrants from many different backgrounds who were challenging the Anglo-Saxon Protestant ideal and literally heading off in wagons to homestead across the country. So in the mid-19th century, this wagon could well hold German Catholics, for example, who would have been a key target for nativist discrimination in the period. So this brings us back to the Sonntag-Duncanson relationship and to thinking about the issues of race built into the American landscape tradition. And we thought a good place to start that conversation would be in the comparison of these two images. Now, Blue Hole, Floodwaters, Little Miami River is not in the present exhibition, but it is an exceptionally well-known work by Duncanson that pairs quite nicely with fishing on the Potomac. It's also a work where many scholars have suggested that we can actually see Duncanson's African-American identity built into his landscape piece. So now I'm going to turn to kind of a longish question for Wendy here to get us started on the conversational section. So personally, I have often struggled to see some of the larger metaphors of race that scholars have suggested are represented in Blue Hole. We've heard comments that the figures are racially ambiguous, possibly African American. It's very hard to see skin tone. We've also had suggestions in scholarship that the water itself, dividing this landscape into two, might suggest that distance between enslavement and freedom, so present in the culture of a city like Cincinnati on that border. In the mid-19th century. Of course, I'm uncomfortable seeing too much in the work that Duncanson doesn't explicitly delve into, that we don't know for certain he's thinking about. Yet I also understand, of course, that it would be impossible for him to be fully upfront about race and racism in Cincinnati in 1851 when he makes this painting. These challenging ambiguities really came to the forefront for me when I look at these two particular paintings side by side. There's so much we could say about the common visual strategies, the landscape subject matter that's just similar. So I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about the ways in which scholarship has done justice to Duncanson, and also where a comparison like this suggests some possible missed opportunities for us.
Yeah, that's a great question, as all your questions were. Can y'all hear me? Okay. I think that with Duncanson, it is really tempting to read a lot into his paintings because he is one of the only, and certainly the most well-known landscape painters of African descent of that era. And I do believe that Black artists were, that Black artists were political, and that Black people in general took whatever opportunities were afforded them to push boundaries, even if they had to be very subtle about it. But on the other hand, that's only reading into the painting. What we can see actually see in the painting is just as Julia says. There's no indication of race. There's no indication of location, exact location. Yes, that's a nice narrative that these are possibly mixed race people, and that's the Cincinnati River, and maybe it is about freedom, or even if we just take it at surface value and compare it to Sonntag's work and others like it, taking that claiming of the landscape, that homesteading, that idea of settling and quote unquote civilizing the land that so many of these Anglo-American landscape paintings were professing to achieve, putting that in the hands of a Black artist, claims that for Black people as well. But it could also and equally just be him trying to participate alongside artists like Sonntag and Kensett and the other landscape artists in this very popular form of painting that American audiences and patrons were hungry for. And so it could have nothing to do with race at all, except that the artist is Black. And so it's really difficult to ascertain how much is reading into it because he is a Black man. But understanding Duncanson just at face value with what we have is already a political act because he is a Black man participating in this landscape making process, which is also about claiming the land and advertising the land as available. So because he's a Black man painting these kinds of scenes, he's claiming that space for himself and for Black people. I don't know. That's kind of my take on it a little bit.
And certainly we know that Duncanson is incredibly successful at this.
Yes.
This craft of landscape painting, he's able to travel much more successfully than Sonntag ultimately does in Europe, making a name for himself among European artists, and pursuing what we know is very ambitious subject matter involving poetry and contemporary writers.
The top level of American painting, landscapes were like the upper echelon. It was, to be a landscape painter in America was like being a history painter in Europe in this period because of how popular the genre was. So for him to throw his hat in that particular ring was really ambitious, and it shows an immense amount of self-confidence, and rightfully so, because his landscapes are wonderful.
Indeed. And maybe we can dig a little bit more into this particular question by pursuing this thread of the idea of whether Duncanson was Sonntag's student or not. So in my catalog essay, which some folks may have read, others won't have had the chance, I raise a concern that I developed while working on this research. So namely, Duncanson and Sonntag's careers are functioning on the same rough timeline. This painting's from 1851, that one is from 1858. They're close, and they're both kind of near the beginning of both artists' careers. At most, from the evidence we currently have, Sonntag began painting professionally a year or two before Duncanson. Now, I'm not attempting to say that they don't have a close relationship, but and you and I have talked about this, the question that I've been seeking to dig into more is what would that nature of the relationship have been? So you have a really deep knowledge of the career paths available to Black artists in the South and in these borderland states in this period. Can you help me think through this question a bit more? Should we keep repeating this idea that Duncanson studied with Sonntag?
I would say no, and it's because of something that you told me and that is in your catalog, and that is that it really was, the idea that Duncanson was Sonntag's student was not verified. It was said once by somebody, and then scholars continued to repeat that vignette that was said by somebody, but there's no actual evidence indicating that Duncanson was Sonntag's student. Now, there are lots of Black artists who studied with white painters and who benefited from, that tutelage and who remained close professionally with their former instructor afterwards. But what happens here, I think, in this scenario is it becomes paternalizing. And it suggests that Duncanson could only have had that close relationship with Sonntag as mentor-mentee, as student and teacher, that kind of thing, and not that they were kind of on equal footing, traveling together to Europe, sharing studio space perhaps, having a collegial relationship. And what I found is that most of the Black students of white artists are significantly younger, started their careers much later. The older artists had an established foothold in the art world, very successful studio when the Black artist is working with them. That's not the case for Sonntag and Duncanson, so it doesn't really make sense. If it made sense, then yes, let's celebrate it, but because it's a repeated rumor with no evidence, it just seems to put Duncanson in Sonntag's shadow instead of trying to really tease out what that professional relationship as colleagues could have been. Mm-hmm. And that is much more interesting to think about, I think.
It seems like it could be fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how we build that out and really understand it.
Yeah, and without more evidence to understand more about Sonntag, but also how they were to each other, what they were to each other. It is it's speculation, and it's really difficult to, but I think you can uncover and unpack a lot in that, even in that gray area, with more work done there instead of just relying on assumptions. I ran into this same thing in my book, where it had been repeated that this artist painted a self-portrait. He was the first African-American. It was reportedly the first African-American self-portrait ever. But it turns out that this woman in the 1930s just said it. Scholars found it in a newspaper, repeated that, even though there's no evidence. Mm-hmm. And so recently, people have reconsidered the portrait. And it's disappointing that not documented as the first African-American self-portrait. So it's, the same kind of thing here. It's you don't have that certainty of the relationship that you can hang your hat on, but it's interesting to think about and to dig a little bit deeper and see what the other possibilities could be about that relationship. And I think a relationship of colleagues and friends in this period across races is far more interesting than student and teacher.
It's tantalizing.
It is.
It's something, hopefully we're going to be able to do some more research on, but for me it was a big door that opened as I'm reading those sources. We certainly do know they knew each other. They shared studio space in Cincinnati. They were in Europe together and on the same timeline for some portion of that first trip. And we have some reference to Sonntag in letters from Duncanson back home,
Right.
that he's sending back to Cincinnati. But also, as Wendy and I have talked about, the primary sources in published newspapers just don't mention Duncanson when they're talking about Sonntag's trip to Europe, which makes sense.
Yeah.
But is also frustrating.
Yes. With archival research, you're always looking for that smoking gun and rarely find it, but you just have to keep digging.
So while we're on this topic, I wonder if we can also talk about what I found the most challenging detail of Sonntag's biography. It's not something I was the first person to discover, but obviously in 2023, I think this is something we need to unpack more than earlier scholarship has done. An article that was published about Sonntag in 1858, shortly after he relocated to New York City, shortly after he takes this trip to Europe that both he and Duncanson were on, it introduces Sonntag to the New York City art world, and it's a biography of him. And it begins by celebrating explicitly his Anglo-Saxon bloodlines. We don't know if Sonntag endorsed this description. There's very little archival material, primary source documents written by Sonntag himself in collections, but he never publicly renounced it either. I'm going to read what this anonymous author wrote about Sonntag so that everyone in this room can hear it and we can engage with this description. So the author states, quote, "The ancestral record of Americans, as a general thing, is not of unbroken lines of greatness. We are in more ways than one a mixed race, with a parentage drawn from leading races of Europe, and lines here and there touched with Indian and African blood. Families which preserve lineage and blood with Norman or Anglo-Saxon or Celtic or Scandinavian purity are the exception. To this class, Mr. Sonntag belongs, and whatever virtue of pure descent he therefore inherits. His family are of the best Saxon blood, coming from Frankfurt on the Main," end quote. So for me, this article really complicates the desire to celebrate Sonntag as a racially forward-thinking individual and as a mentor to Duncanson. And again, I'm not the first person writing about Sonntag to want to celebrate that idea that he's liberal. But how do we reconcile it with this passage? I think it illustrates some of the complexities of seeing race in the 19th century and the challenges if we apply just a binary way of thinking about it. But could you share some thoughts on how to puzzle through Sonntag's seeming openness to work with Duncanson, maybe considering him a colleague, and yet also not rejecting attitudes that might be expressed this way?
Yeah, I think that it's tempting to look at a statement like that and Sonntag's silence about it, which seems to be kind of implicit acceptance of it, and say, well, how could he be racially forward? But if you think about the period, there was almost a universal belief amongst white people that white people were superior. So even if you take the staunchest abolitionists, Abraham Lincoln wasn't a staunch abolitionist, but Abraham Lincoln, if you look at him and his ilk, they were pro-abolition, happy to free the slaves, thought that slavery was immoral, but they did not believe that black people should have the right to vote because they thought they needed the paternalistic guiding hand of white people to help them through. So I say all that, I use that example to say that I think it's perfectly plausible that on the one hand, Sonntag could think of himself as pure Saxon and whatever that means, and therefore of a superior bloodline and white and therefore superior to Duncanson, and still be friends with him and collegial with him and want to engage with him as an artist. I don't think that those would be, and yes, he could very well have thought, because a lot of times with racism, you see things differently when white people are looking at things in general versus specific examples, people that you know. So Sonntag might have thought of Duncanson as a very talented exception, but he was an exception. And so I see that a lot in my work in Louisiana as well. There's lots of relationships between white and black artists working there in the 19th century. And they are working side by side, promoting each other, you know, really engaging with one another, but the line of race was there, even if they were willing to step over it a little bit from time to time. It didn't mean that it was invisible. So I think that is perfectly, it would have made sense in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, let me list all the decades. It would have made perfect sense for Sonntag to, on the one hand, believe in his racial superiority, but on the other hand, still be collegial with Duncanson and, you know, work with him and be friendly.
I appreciate having the chance to think through this particular point with you, because another aspect of the quotation that resonates differently with me now, talking about it with you, is how it opens with that section on mixed race.
Yeah.
And how almost all Americans are mixed race.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of the literature,
even more
exactly,
superior, because he's not. Don't get it. Don't mistake
right,
it.
He is German.
Yeah.
And a lot of the literature on Duncanson actually highlights that he's mixed race as well, right? And that there's this question of how people might have seen him racially, sometimes at least.
Yeah, it certainly would have, because he was light-skinned, it would have been easier for him to navigate the world in general, although he wasn't light enough to pass, I don't think. I don't recall reading anything where he was passing for white, but just because he was physically less threatening, less obviously black, and so it would have, that carries with it a certain amount of privilege, so he would have been able to navigate his world a little easier. Not easy, but easier, because of his physical appearance and his mixed race ancestry, even if it wasn't, in the time, something that people were really, digging into.
And it does, speaking to that way in which people talk about race in the 19th century, that quotation almost sort of invites in Duncanson, while also
keeping him out.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Both at the same time.
Yeah, which I think is exactly what exactly the liminal position that Duncanson would have had in the 19th century art world in general, in and out.
In and out at once. So I'm going to put up the other comparison that we have with Duncanson, just so we have something different to look at for the last bit of our conversation. Now, the image here on my left, audience right, by Duncanson is in our present exhibition, and it was a really exciting thing to us to be able to bring in one of Duncanson's works. It's from the Crystal Bridges Museum collection. And I paired these particular pieces because, again, thinking about ways in which landscape is landscape, both of them have elements of industry that are being featured. In Sonntag's work, we have this mill, which is falling apart, with a rowboat that also is decomposing. And some scholars have suggested that Sonntag's representation of landscapes of Virginia from the 1860s show this as a way of engaging with the Civil War. And the Crystal Bridges work, as you can see, is dated to 1865, is thought by the museum to show a location in Canada. We do know that Duncanson spends the war not in the United States. So it's an interesting comparison. for those reasons. So I have just one more question for Wendy here. She might have some for me. So as I worked on this project, I came to feel strongly that the case of Sonntag as an understudied artist revealed a lot about the values of landscape scholars to date. As an artist who focused on Virginia, West Virginia, Southern Maryland, Ohio, Sonntag's subject matter was peripheral to the dominant Northeast scenes of the Hudson River schools. So he did represent the Northeast coast regularly throughout his career. He did live in New York City, but he continued to show these landscapes that are different from those shown by his Northeast coast colleagues. Sonntag also skewed big moral and historical themes in his works. Unlike Duncanson, as we already talked about, he didn't show that particular interest. And he liked to mix and match motifs so that he could produce work more quickly, because he was very interested in the market, selling his work.
Yeah.
None of these aspects of Sonntag's career are artistic attributes that art historians typically are drawn to put it gently, right? So perhaps they have contributed to some of the muted interest in Sonntag's work, since the field of American art really began to invest in landscape studies, which is a long time. Of all the threads in our mutual field, it's one of the longest.
Yeah.
But what seems most surprising to me is how Sonntag's relationship with Duncanson has not led to more exhaustive research into his practice, at least his early career. Instead, it's just led to those more frequent mentions of him. I'd love for us to talk a bit about how this relates to the larger tradition of how African American art history has been integrated or not into the larger scholarship of the field of American art. Is this a one-off issue? Or do you see this as more deeply related to the issues of race and identity within the field of American art more broadly, and of course with American landscape as specifically as we can?
Yeah, I think I think you hit the nail on the head with that question, as a matter of fact. I think that often African American art is siloed in American art history, which is a problem, but especially 18th and 19th century, or 17th, 18th, and 19th century African American art, it isn't even really deeply considered in African American art. So, and it's even less so in general American art. A lot of African American art, and you can see this reflected in most of the textbooks on the subjects. They want to start at the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, because that is the first cohesive African American collective art movement that was self-conscious and that is art about being Black. Whereas you look at artists like Duncanson, and it's hard to see race in his work, right? Like, you look at this painting, it could have been done by anybody. And you could think of it in terms, of course, of the Civil War and of Canada and of freedom and of escape and those kinds of things. And there are plenty of American landscape paintings, not just by Duncanson, but by other artists done during this period that seem to be metaphors for the Civil War, right? Including this work by Sonntag. So that's not unusual, but because if it's a statement at all, it would be a metaphorical statement and nothing direct. And most African American art and artists from this early period weren't making art about being Black. They were making art that looked just like their white counterparts, because that's how they were trained. That's what they knew. That's what was popular. That's where the market was. You wanted a portrait, they can do you a portrait, and it's going to look just like the portrait by this European American artist who is in the studio next door, because that's what people wanted. Same with the landscape paintings. And so while the idea of having a Black artist do this stuff, yes, that's political, and yes, we can, read these paintings metaphorically and see issues of race perhaps subtly raised in them, but it's never going to be like a sure shot. Duncanson didn't write that I'm doing this in this painting, and this means X, Y, and Z. So it's always going to be an inference. It does not look black in any way, right? So race isn't openly referenced in this art. So it often gets pretty much passed over. And you'll have a few artists like Duncanson who pop up and they're quickly move on. You spend more time thinking about, like an American art survey class, thinking about people like Thomas Cole and, the other Frederick Church, the other Hudson River heavy hitters. And, oh yeah, there was this black dude in, Cincinnati doing this stuff too for a minute. Here's one Duncanson, is usually the Uncle Tom's Cabin painting or something like that, because that is about
Explicit,
race. Yeah. And then you move on. And so I think that African American art and artists are often siloed in general, or just passed over with few representatives. And there's a lot of work to be done there, especially in the 19th century, with unpacking what their projects were in landscape, for example, what Duncanson was really trying to do. Learning more about him and his career and his biography, but also really reading his paintings more, because I think that's another thing with African American art. It becomes biographies and less about interpreting the actual work.
And the search for skin color and motifs that we can identify. One of the things that I thought about with these two artists is that this early period in their career, let's say, when they're both in Cincinnati, has been poorly understood, of course. There's not a whole lot of documentation. But it's a moment when there are a lot of other emerging landscape painters also in Cincinnati. In the exhibit, there are several who would have been in Ohio around this time. And even Thomas Cole himself came through Ohio at one point in his life.
I didn't know that. That's very cool.
So it seems to me that one of the strategies that can negotiate the siloing that you're talking about is thinking about those communities of artists. Again, not to say it's unimportant that Sonntag is African American by all means, but Duncanson. but to think about the association of these artists, perhaps as colleagues in a group of others, none of whom have been well researched.
And think about regional art and regional, because when you think about landscape painting, so much gets, shifted to the Northeast, the Hudson River School, and all of those guys. But you kind of answered one of my questions to you, why wasn't Sonntag more, popular? Why didn't his work sell more? But also, why didn't the works of other regional artists working in this style not sell as much, or why don't we know as much about these guys? You would think that they would be very popular and have, thriving careers in the area from which they came and where they were working. So why aren't they as big names as people like Church and Cole and the like?
My impression is that in terms of collectors being interested in, say, Sonntag, that his work is collected, and there are regional museums quite interested in Sonntag. In fact, this exhibit pulls together several museum pieces from the region. But I think that scholarship is quite biased toward New York City, the Catskill Mountains, New England, and many of the major scholars of landscape have been located in that region themselves. And in addition, of course, many of these artists moved to New York City. Sonntag is a bit exceptional in keeping to represent motifs from this region, in part because of his work with the Baltimore and Ohio Railway that paid him to do that.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting question, which I think we could dig into a lot more, but that's my gut answer.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And you also answered it with his particular subject matter, which didn't happen to be like the most sought after of landscape scenes that people were looking to collect.
So I think we've used up our time and should throw it open for questions. Does that seem good?
Is this on? Yes, thank you both. We do have a microphone here, but I find that if you have a question and you want to just stand and project, that would work too, if it's too cumbersome to get down here. If anyone has a question, shout out.
Photographs of what Sonntag looks like or what Duncanson looks like. Do we have any photography or?
We don't in the slideshow. There was in some of the marketing. So I actually don't know what Sonntag looked like, but I am very familiar with Duncanson's photos. There's a couple in a public collection in Canada that we pulled from for our marketing, but I don't know if you two want to speak to that.
In Nancy Moore's book on William Lewis Sonntag, there are a few reproductions of his appearance. I think there is at least one photo and maybe a couple prints from the 19th century.
Age difference.
I don't know.
So the letter that I was particularly thinking of in that comment was a letter that Duncanson wrote to Nicholas Longsworth, who was a very prominent patron of his in Cincinnati and an abolitionist leader, and he also knew Sonntag. So the mention of Sonntag was to basically a mutual acquaintance. And he talks about how Sonntag has not, it's a reference just about his stylistic maturation or not, like how his work has changed since they were both painting in Cincinnati together.
That's an interesting comment, though, because it does suggest that they were still seeing each other, you know,
Some
in each other's
association.
circles, in Europe, and that they're kind of keeping tabs on each other, again, kind of as colleagues in competition.
And Margot, I checked, they're 1 year apart. So Duncanson was born in 1821, Sonntag 1822.
Well, I guess my initial question, how much of the work is produced from observation? I know y'all kind of spoke to around it maybe, but yeah, are they painting observation or these fantasy landscapes?
So I don't know as much about Duncanson's individual practice with respect to that, but Sonntag did do quite a number of sketching trips where he would study landscapes. In particular, he, as I mentioned, was recruited by the Baltimore and Ohio Railway to represent works along their corridor. So he's known to have taken quite a number of trips on that beautiful railroad landscape between Baltimore and the West. However, a lot of his works are produced in the studio, as was the standard, and I would expect Duncanson would be similar in this regard. And we know that Sonntag liked to mix and match things. When you're in the exhibit and you read some of the panels where I talk a bit more in detail about the works as you're walking through, you'll see one particular comment from a critic who said, Sonntag is so convincing, you almost think you've been to that place, and then you realize it's a pastiche. It'll be a bunch of things he's put together, and that actually is a breakthrough moment for him in the 1850s, when around the time this critic is commenting on that practice, because he's able to make nature more real than nature is what they're kind of implying at that moment in time. So a lot of people are very interested in knowing, is this particular Sonntag X location, or can we verify that it's Y location? And quite often that would be a challenge, and my understanding is it might not even be the best way to think about his work.
It seems really interesting perspective of how this campaign is functioning like documentation of somebody what's being documented perspective. You know, like walking up the mountain, look, like looking at the sea, that's kind of this landscape. And even like, you know, tone, they're much darker, so there's less idealization. I guess I said that my second follow-up question. You all use the word we a lot, and both the artists seem to be in a conscious control of who's looking at gaze. Now, I guess I wonder if you could just break down, use a generalization like we, like what that is, like who is that, maybe how does that relate to particular words? What makes sense?
I think when we say we, when we say we are referring to American art scholars, maybe, or even like the general American art audience of the period. I think that's how we used it today.
I need to go check for that word and see.
And I also think that it's a really good point that you bring up about the control of the gaze in these landscape paintings. That is so important, right? One scholar, and I can't remember who, called it the magisterial gaze, especially that high point looking out onto the vista of the land. And I think you can find that in a lot of American landscapes, this kind of ownership of the land. America didn't have ancient ruins. It didn't have Gothic cathedrals, but it had land. And the whole idea was that land was there, was full of natural resources. It was places that could be, you know, that people could go to, could settle, could cultivate. The land was wealth. The land also was already occupied, you know, but you don't see that in a lot of these. That gets carefully erased, like, especially when you're talking about landscapes from this period, and thinking about specificity of place. It could be a specific place, but that doesn't mean that it is an accurate representation of that place, because even if you can pinpoint exactly where, you know, where it was painted, where the artist even would have had their easel to paint that scene, they probably would have altered it. They probably did alter it to better fit whatever statement they wanted to make about the land. So there is no real truth in landscape painting. It's all about, you know, whatever it's used for, an advertisement for railroad companies, come out west. This is what's there. Whether it is, you know, an advertisement for people to go and, you know, grab the land and settle it out west, move, manifest destiny, all that stuff. Propaganda for what? Yeah, a lot of it was, wasn't it? But also talking about industrialization of the land, and even, and I think I've seen this painting and I've read that it was, yeah, that it was also kind of about like the demise of the land because of the industrialization. How it could be like kind of the dark side of things like milling. Is that what it's called, milling?
Yeah, the old mill has that motif of an industry that's not been successful.
Yeah.
And that's quite an interesting comment to me, Wendy, because there's a fair amount of literature on one particular landscape artist, Thomas Cole's interest in environmental causes. And I've never really seen that with this particular image, but I think it could be.
I think I read about it in David Nye's The Technological Sublime.
Interesting, okay.
But it could be another, I'm almost 100%, no, I'm 90% sure it was a Sonntag painting, but maybe not this one.
He did do a number of old mill paintings.
Okay.
But I really think that it would make sense with his way of thinking that he does love this landscape and he doesn't want to see environmental degradation. So that would be another strand of all the ways we haven't seen Sonntag. That's another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did we answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's, I really think it's interesting. I would just, sorry, just wasn't, I feel like Cole's perspective on stewardship, and not about benefits. It's still about dominion, it's still about its destiny, it's still paternalistic.
And a lot of those landscapes could function on all those levels at once. Thinking about artists like Bierstadt in his paintings of the West, even before he actually went out west, when he was painting the Alps from memory and calling it the Rockies, it's still, it's about preservation, but it's also about manifest destiny, right? And he was employed by a railroad company with the idea of tourism and getting people out west. So it was like 3 different levels that you could look at those landscapes at. But weren't those landscapes, and I'm asking you because you are the real expert on landscapes, but weren't they part of the reason why Teddy Roosevelt wanted to start the national park system and, like why landscape preservation became?
Landscape painting in general, definitely. I think I associate that in my head with Thomas Moran's work
That
and
makes sense. Yeah.
the images of the Grand Canyon.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, speakers, and thank you, audience, for your questions. They'll be around if anybody wants to chat with them. I had a few, but I didn't have time to ask them, so I'll get you later. But the exhibit's open, so please, and we do have a few surveys to fill out up there if you have a chance. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you so much. That was fun.